It's Darby of RiverBendSurvival again. Today, as much as I hate to do it to you, it's time to learn something. Now, this is part of the basic bushcrafting series, and like I said at the beginning of this series, a lot of this stuff is going to be so very basic, but there are people out there who have already been writing me by the dozens, talking about just little simple things that they didn't already know, and that's the point of this series. Today's video is going to be on what exactly is fire. I know that sounds like a silly topic, but the number one cause that I have found in all the years I've been doing this and showing people how to do it, that they don't get a fire started, is because they don't understand exactly what a fire is. Once that clicks in their head, it's so quick and so easy to figure out what's going wrong and correct it in the vast majority of times. Now, before I go any further with this, I want to cover one little quick topic real quick. I have gotten some private messages about the new school shirts, the new RiverBendSurvival shirts with a new logo on it. They are not for sale. I don't make anything, I don't sell anything. These are strictly for instructors. There's different varieties, and some people have already noticed that some have camouflage sleeves, some have brown sleeves, some have green sleeves, there's a bunch of different varieties to it, but this is not an item that I sell because I don't sell items. So I want to cover that real quick here. Let's get to fire. What exactly is fire? The most simple possible answer to that question is fire is burning gas. It doesn't matter if you were burning wood, it doesn't matter if you're burning gasoline. Fire is burning gas. Now, you've heard me say probably 1,000 times in my other videos, I'm not an expert at this, I'm not an expert at that. I'm going to make an exception on this one subject here. When it comes to fire, I am an expert. I am a certified fire marshal. I have been a fire marshal during major catastrophes on board naval ships. I have done the theoretical damage control courses. I have trained thousands of people, literally thousands of people in firefighting. What is fire? How does fire work? So if I start to kind of drift off a little bit, stick with me on this because I'll bring it back around to the point. Fire, no matter what it is just a burning of gas. Three things are needed. This is called the fire triangle. This is the basis of all firefighting techniques, firefighting teaching. There are three things that you must have to have a fire. You must have fuel. You'll have to excuse my handwriting. I'm not it ain't good on the best of days, let alone on a dry race. You must have fuel. Now, in a minute, I'll explain to you that there is no difference whether your fuel comes from this piece of wood or it comes from this lighter. Fuel is fuel, and I'll explain that here in just a few minutes. The next thing you must have is oxygen. Without oxygen, fire can't burn. It's the exact same thing as if you think about your car. If your air intake gets stopped, the car stops running because it can't get air into the combustion cylinder. The last thing that a fire needs, and this is where it comes in real important in bushcrafting, I got to turn on you here, is heat. Without heat, you don't have fire. Point blank. You must have heat to get fire. What happens is when these three things come together in the same place, it forms a combustion chamber. And it doesn't matter if it's, I say combustion chamber, it's not going to be a physical chamber, but it is an area of combustion. Now, this is going to become important when I talk about this area of combustion on this next section. Now, as you could probably figure out, I am not what would be considered a world-class artist. It doesn't matter for this. When I told you a few minutes ago that there is no difference between the fuel in this piece of wood or this lighter, I meant exactly what I said. Fire comes about, we'll get rid of the lighter for now because everybody knows what a lighter is. Fire comes about from this wood gets heated. When the wood gets heated, it releases gases that are flammable. Those gases are then what catches on fire. What's left behind is just like the plastic casing for this lighter. What's left behind is the particles that were used to hold the flammable chemicals together. When chemicals heat up, they start to move. As the faster, the hotter they get, the faster they move. The faster they move, the more likelihood of them breaking apart into their separate elements. So, when you add heat to the wood, what you're actually doing is you're starting to spin those elements. Those particles are just starting to move and vibrate until they start to break apart. Now, as a general rule, wood more or less around 500 degrees. When you get it around 500 degrees, it starts to release chemicals. Once those chemicals are released, they will catch on fire. If there's oxygen and there's heat, that's where the combustion chamber comes together. Now, because you have the heat released the flammable chemicals, and then the heat is going to catch those chemicals on fire, and the oxygen is going to keep it burning. So, if you've ever looked at a candle, this is my candle down here, by the way. Here's the wick. Now, I drew it kind of funny here so you would see exactly what I'm talking about. But if you look at it, if you light a candle and you look at the wick, you will see that there is a gap that runs all the way around that wick. That gap is actually an area where there is more gas, because the wick does burn eventually, but the wick is really no more different than the top of this big lighter. It's providing the flame, the way for the fuel to escape. So what happens in that gap that you'll see when you look at it, and it can be a fire on a log, it can be anything, but we'll stick with the candle right now. That gap that you see is where there is fuel being discharged out of this wick. Where it's being discharged at, there is a gap where it's pushing the oxygen away. So there's no oxygen there. Without the oxygen, remember, you got your triangle. Without your oxygen, if you're missing that part, you don't have fire. But what happens is the farther it gets away, the less dense it becomes. As it becomes less dense, it allows oxygen to mix in. Once the oxygen mixes in with the heat, that's where your fire starts. Okay? So, you'll have fuel coming up because the wax is melting. In this case, the wax is melting. In this case, it's because it's heating up. The same thing. It's the exact same principle. This is heating up, and while it's heating up, it's releasing gas. What's left over at the end when you burn wood is pretty much carbon. There's some other chemicals that are in there, but for the principle of this video, we'll keep it short. When you make char cloth and you heat up char cloth, what you're doing is that little flame that's coming out of the top of the tinder box or the char box that you're using, that little flame coming out that people use as a tattletale is the flammable gases being released. Now, here's why it's important to remember that. Because if you take a lighter to char cloth and you light it, the char cloth doesn't burn. It doesn't give off a flame. The reason it doesn't give off a flame is because those gases have already been released. What you have left is the remnants, which is what you want in the case of char cloth, because that now becomes your heat for your next fire when you put it into the particles that you want to heat up. So when you take your char cloth, you put it into your nest and you start blowing on it, you're now providing heat and oxygen. When you provide the heat and oxygen and you're blowing on it, it starts to heat up because you're applying the heat. The bird's nest material, it starts releasing the gases, and then the gases catch on fire and you go, oh man, I have made fire. That's what's happening. Okay, let's talk about the next part of this. When you have a piece of wood and you put a match or some source down here, that's a horrible flame. Anyway, you put a flame down here. What happens is when we're giving off heat, and almost all heat technically all heat rises, but in the case of an open flame like this, you're going to get 85% of your heat is going to go straight up if there's no wind affecting the heat. That just leaves 15% to radiate off to the sides. So you have your flame coming up, your heat rising. The heat is what you're after. The heat is rising up here. When this little corner of this wood right here gets to, now this is real close. I'm not going to get into the exact measurement because it also changes depending on the type of wood. When it gets to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, it starts to break down and release gas. It will also start to smoke. Smoke is gas. Once it reaches this area right here, the gas, where the gas is at, and remember we have to have the combustion happen. When this gas gets to right around 500 degrees Fahrenheit, this becomes its own heat source. Once this becomes its own heat source, the external heat no longer needs to be there. It is now taking care of itself. Now, why that becomes so important is because if you cannot get up to the 300 degrees, you're not going to release the gas. If you can't continue on another 200 degrees Fahrenheit to get to this magic number here, you are not going to get it to ignite. When I was talking about the char cloth earlier, when you're blowing on it, you're adding oxygen to it, you're making it burn hotter and faster. When it's burning, it's going to make the gases be released from your bird's nest, and then those gases being released, when you blow, when you see it on videos, you see instructors say all the time, now blow hard, blow, blow, blow. Everybody starts doing that, blow now. That's because they can see the smoke, whether they know that's what they're seeing, they can see the smoke. When the smoke is coming out, that means you have reached the first threshold. Once that threshold is reached, that is the critical time. That is when you have to get as much heat as you possibly can into that smoke. Once you reach the magic 500 degrees, that's when it goes poof. Okay, so far we've covered the combustion chamber, or the combustion area. We've covered the heat. We've covered the fuel, what the fuel is and how it actually gets released. The last thing we need to touch on here before I finish this up is the oxygen. A fire needs 16% oxygen to be sustained. If it goes down to 15% or lower, your fire is going to go out. The air we breathe across the vast majority of the world is 21% oxygen. So there's ample there's ample oxygen in the air that we breathe every day to get to that 16%. Where the problem comes in, one of the problems comes in for people in bushcrafting that are just starting out, or even some people who have been doing it a long time. We'll use the example of the bird's nest. When you close that bird's nest up and you have something in there that is drawing oxygen at a rate of 16% or needs 16% oxygen, it is drawing it and you are not allowing air to go back in. Remember, air is just molecules. It has to move. Think of it like water through a creek. If you throw a branch down there, it goes a little bit slower, it takes longer to get through. If you throw a bunch of stuff in there, it takes a lot longer to go through until you eventually build a dam and no water's going through. Same thing with a bird's nest. You have to get oxygen into that combustion area. So, when it drops down below, you see it happen all the time. It may have happened to you. You'll be going, and that thing will be, you'll see your char cloth is about 50% used up. You still have 50% to go. Smoke's starting to come, and all of a sudden it just goes, poof. Nothing happens. The odds are, if your char cloth is still going when it happens, the odds are you ran out of oxygen. You have to get that oxygen level up. If your char cloth all burns up, the odds are that your fuel was damp or wasn't broken up enough to get a, when I drew that piece of wood a minute ago, I put that little tip down here with the flame going up to it. It's kind of a good example actually. You want to heat up right here because the more heat you can put into a direct area, the hotter that area is going to get quicker. So you need to break it up into your bird's nest into as fine of materials as possible. Same thing when they start talking about, when we start talking about adding kindling and different things, the different steps to building a fire. You'll notice that it goes from as tiny as possible and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. That has to do with the transfer of heat into the new source of fuel. Okay, let's get into the last section of this. I told you at the beginning of this, there is no difference when it comes to fire between a piece of wood and a Bic lighter or a can of gas. This wood is nothing more than the plastic container to carry the flammable gases that are trapped inside of here. They're not a gas at this point. That's the difference between a lighter and a piece of wood. This is already in gas form, and all you're doing is adding a spark to it, which is the heat, and then it's mixing with the oxygen. That's all there is to it. Exact same thing here, except here you have to release, turn that solid into a gas so that it'll burn. I'll be doing a video pretty soon. I'll probably do it this week, start filming it, of making fat wood. And I think it's always funny when I hear people go, that ain't making fat wood, that's putting chemicals in a piece of wood. Duh! Every time you start a fire with a piece of wood, you're releasing chemicals from the wood. A piece of fat wood is nothing more than the exact same tree, except it has more chemicals in it. The sap has settled in that piece. There's no difference. It's nice to be able to find fat wood and use it in a survival situation, but instead of going and cutting up a tree and ripping out the fat wood out of it, I think I'd rather make them at home and use that. Problems. When people cannot get a fire started, it is because the triangle is not completed for one reason or another. If you have wood and you have heat, you should have fire. Now, here's why it's important. This is where it all starts to come together. If you have smoke and you have heat, the odds are, and this is strictly odds, the odds are you're missing oxygen. You're not getting enough oxygen to it if it's smoking. If you're not getting smoke, the odds are that you don't have enough heat. And the number one reason that you're not going to have enough heat is either you didn't add enough heat with the source you're using, or number two is because the wood is wet. Wet wood burns. Everybody's caught wet wood on fire. The reason wet wood doesn't burn as quickly, doesn't catch on fire as quickly, is because you have to heat up the water molecules. Water is a cooling agent. When you look at this fire triangle from a firefighter standpoint, when you want to put out a wood fire, a class alpha fire, when you want to put it out, you want to cool it. Remove the heat. The way to do that, attach the H2O particles to the particles inside. Now the fire, your heat source, has to heat that up, burn that off before it can start heating the wood itself to start releasing those chemicals that are going to catch on fire. So, the number one reasons people don't get fire started is they don't have enough oxygen to the fire, or they're not getting enough heat to the wood. Remember, holding a lighter to a wet piece of wood and holding a lighter to a dry piece of wood, any kid can tell you the difference. One catches on fire quick and the other takes a long, long time. So, if you're not getting it and you're getting smoke, the odds are you don't have enough heat to get to that magic 500 degrees. If you have your fuel and you have plenty of heat, the odds are you're not getting enough oxygen to it. You've got it too compact, it's too smashed, it's down in the ground, whatever the case may be, you're not getting enough air to it to get to that magic 16% of oxygen. If you have plenty of oxygen, you have plenty of heat, then the odds are your fuel is wet. Your fuel has not gotten to the point where it is releasing the chemicals inside to catch on fire. I have seen people just wear out. a ferrocerium, I mean just striking that rod until they've almost worn the thing away on the same piece of wet wood. If the wood's wet, you have to dry it first. Period. Or go find another piece that's not wet. And we'll get into some of that later, but most of you know the deal with that. So, next time you're trying to start a fire, doesn't matter if you're doing it with a bow drill, if you're doing it with flint and steel, if you're doing a bird's nest, if you're using a fire starter, and it doesn't start to light, think about this triangle and think about the effects that each individual thing has and figure out which one of the three, or sometimes you'll be missing two of the three, but figure out what you're missing from it to get it to 500 degrees Fahrenheit, the source material, your fuel, to get it to 500 degrees Fahrenheit, to get it to 300 degrees Fahrenheit to release the gas, and then get it up to 500 degrees Fahrenheit to ignite the gas, and making sure the whole time that you have at least 16% oxygen going to it. Until next time, get out in the dirt and have some fun. Thanks.